It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Ecclesiastical History Society's 2022 Summer Conference. I've just got a couple of things to do before I bow out and make way for our new president. Just before I introduce her, let me just say when it comes to the discussions, the discussion at the end of this lecture, please use the chat function on Zoom to indicate if you'd like to ask a question. You can just put Q into the chat, and then I'll call on you to ask your question. If you would like to book a question slot while Francis is still speaking, then do feel free. But perhaps you could then message just me rather than the whole group, as it can be a bit distracting for everybody else. And I'm sure I don't need to say this by now, but just in case, do please stay muted unless you are actually asking a question. So let me introduce our new president. I first met Frances Knight nearly 20 years ago, when I was invited to be external examiner for the MA in Church History, which she ran at the University of Wales in Lampeter, where she was the leader of this brilliant little constellation of theologians and historians there, in what felt to me like this sort of academic refuge that I was allowed to visit for 24 hours every year. She was already by then a well-established historian of Victorian Christianity. She'd made a name with her 1995 book on the 19th century Church and English society. And I'm sure she would have prospered in a history department as a Victorianist, but being in theology at Lampeter and in charge of the whole church history program offered her a wider canvas. It was certainly an example that was a big confidence boost for me when a few years later I came to make the jump from history to a theology department. I'd seen how she was able and ready to engage with much bigger period and region spanning questions, looking at big themes. Certainly, for me, her 2008 volume in the Tourist History of Christianity, which covers the whole world in the 19th century, is a really wonderful piece of work. A book that anybody would be proud of. Amazingly wide-ranging, light touch, conceptually sharp survey. All good things come to an end, that's what happened at Lampeter in 2009. But Frances was snapped up by Nottingham, where she became Professor of the History of Christianity and served 2 stints as head of department. And the MA program came with her. And she tells me that it's the professional achievement that she is most proud of. 150 graduates from that program over 20 years, some of them I'm sure here with us today. But at Nottingham, she also produced a string of key publications, including the 2016 book on Victorian Christianity at the SPCK. And she managed to get a COVID-related early retirement, a very early retirement, out of Nottingham last year. And of course, the word retirement is equivalent in meaning to the word vacation. That is the only time you get work done. And she's continuing to work on the SPCK question of how Christianity engaged with the sociocultural issues that bubbled up around the year 1900. And as part of this, she's doing a volume on Ebenezer Howard for OUP's Spiritual Lives series. But it's also this work, I think, that's led her to her presidential theme for the EHS. She should, in the course of things, have been taking over as president this time last year, but for reasons that you are aware of, 2020 was a little bit disrupted. And she and I have, in effect, been co-presidenting for the last 12 months. I'm hugely grateful to her for her support and canniness in navigating these tricky waters. So now at last, it is my great honor formally to inaugurate her as the Society's new president. I can't lay on hands through Zoom. I hope the Society's apostolic succession isn't endangered by using this method. All I can do is welcome her and invite her to deliver her presidential address on SPCK Tracts and Rites of Passage in the long 19th century. confronted.
Well, thank you very much, Alec. I'm really quite overwhelmed by that that very, very kind and generous introduction. I want to start by thanking you, Alec, for your serving your two-year term as president. Nobody deliberately signs up to be EHS president for 2 years, but it has happened on a couple of occasions before, and it's happened this time. And you've been an absolute model of sensible and decisive leadership to us during this very awkward couple of years. And on behalf of the whole committee, I want to thank you very much for all the work and guidance and thought that you have put into the management of the Ecclesiastical History Society. Thank you. Well, the EHS is 60 years old this month. And in every July since 1961, until last summer, the Society held its annual conference at a university in the British Isles. And each conference has been coloured by a very strong sense of place. And this year, and I hope only for this year, the venue is going to be our own home. I'm sure our founding fathers would be utterly astonished if they could see me presiding over an EHS conference by speaking into my computer. And I have to confess that I would have been too, even just 2 years ago. EHS regulars will have noticed that we've retained some of the essential features of the EHS format in this summer's programme. And I do hope that it really will feel like an EHS conference. And to everyone who has logged on, whether you have been attending for the last 50 years, as I know some of you have, whether you turn up occasionally, or whether this is your first outing to the EHS, a big warm welcome from me. I am delighted to see you. I really am. And I have to say, it's a particular pleasure to me to be joined by my PhD supervisor, who I can actually see at the top of the screen, David Thompson, and a number of my postgraduate contemporaries, Eileen and Alex, and also a large cohort of my former postgraduate students. So I feel I have 3 generations of the academic family gathered together in this Zoom call. So it's absolutely lovely to see you all, to have you all here. And I also very much want to thank everybody for sticking with this conference, particularly if it was actually months ago that you were thinking about your paper and you've been struggling with it due to the closure of libraries and archives, or indeed for any other COVID-related reason. I also want to thank you for being here if in fact you've spent most of your life on Zoom or similar platforms over the last year. I'm very well aware that the thought of more screen time has really none of the charms that an in-person conference would have had. But in addition to the undoubted benefits of not risking catching COVID at this conference, there are a couple of other benefits. If, as we expect, everybody keeps to time, it should be possible to move seamlessly between the different streams of communications and without the usual need to run between rooms and hope that there will be enough empty seats. Secondly, you will get to sleep in your own bed, and much as we enjoy conferences, sleeping in student rooms, in student beds, isn't always the most comfortable. Thirdly, if you don't want to spend the breaks, I don't know, catching up on the ironing or watering your roses or whatever it might be, you can stay in the Glasgow Zoom room, which is the one that you are currently in, the Glasgow link, which is going to be running for the whole of the duration of the conference. And you can see who else is there and have a chat with them. And if you would like to have a chat with somebody in particular, if you message Charlotte Methuen, who is the Grand Mistress of the Glasgow Zoom room, she will arrange for you to be put in a breakout room at some suitable point. Well, Alec Ryrie mentioned in a blog a few years ago that playing fantasy EHS themes is something that every aspiring young ecclesiastical historian seeks to do. And I guess I must have done the same. I think Rites of Passage was a fairly easy one for me. I've long been intrigued by that mashup of theology, liturgy, custom and culture and human emotion that they represent. And I also thought, and I feel completely vindicated in this, that this would be a theme that would appeal to you, the participants who have to put in the hard graft of coming up with the papers to fit the president's theme. And so it has turned out to be. We've got a really great programme running over the next 3 days. I really wish I could attend every communication session. I would love to be able to listen to every paper. You will have noticed, I think, that Liz has circulated some abstracts of all the communications to enable everyone to decide the best use of their listening time. So do have a look at that if you are hesitating about what to attend. I also know that we are going to make a really significant contribution to understanding more about the churches and rites of passage over the next 3 days. And that, of course, is really the part of the point of the thing. New ideas are going to form, new connections will be made, and a fabulous new volume of studies in church history will result. It goes without saying that being invited to become president of the Ecclesiastical History Society is an enormous pleasure and privilege. I went to my first conference in the summer before I began my PhD. I met people there who are still friends to this day. 2 years after that, I gave my first paper, and that in turn became my first publication in Studies in Church History, volume 26, so a very long time ago. And of course, for me, these were significant academic rites of passage. And the EHS has really accompanied me in all the stages of my career, from PhD student to professor. And I have gained immeasurably. I am deeply honoured to be the EHS president for 2021-2022. So let's get started. And I'm going to see if my screen share is going to cooperate. Okay, how is that? Fantastic. So as you can see, I selected some colours that would match Studies in Church History for this. And I'm going to talk about SPCK and rites of passage in the long 19th century. Meanings clustered thickly around the Church of England's rites of passage. Some were theological, such as baptismal regeneration, confirmation as the endorsement of orthodox belief by the instructed baptized, marriage as an analogy of the union between Christ and his church, churching as thanksgiving and reincorporation, burial as a prelude to judgment and eternal life. Many more were social and cultural. Although liturgical language smoothed over differing circumstances and perspectives, creating the impression of a shared understanding and of a goal jointly achieved, it was obvious that the participants often engaged in these rites with very different expectations. When church ended, a domestic ritual usually took over. A wedding reception, a baptismal family celebration, a confirmation party in a pub, a funeral tea, and that created further layers of meaning. And the communitas, which Victor Turner, anthropologist and interpreter of Arnold van Gennep, so helpfully identified. Kinship networks were strengthened by merging family and by creating what were often the reciprocal ties of godparenthood, or they were fractured by death or strained by controversial marriage choices. The presence of family, friends, and sometimes the wider community was usually seen as adding to the efficacy of the event, although sometimes the participants wished to keep others at a distance. For several centuries, the Church of England's rites of passage provided the pivots and scaffolding for a myriad of personal crises. But as people came to its churches for these ceremonies, it looked on nervously. It wanted everyone to participate, but it wanted them to do it in what it regarded as the right way. In an attempt to improve correct participation, it adopted a strategy typical of religious organisations and movements of the time. It issued tracts. The idea was that supporters would bulk buy them and give them free to people in their parishes. This afternoon, I'm examining a selection of the tracts issued by the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge relating to marriage, churching, and confirmation during the long 19th century. The SPCK tract collection, which has been in the care of the Cambridge University Library since 1998, has much to tell us about the behaviours that the Church wanted to instil and about the practices that it wanted to stamp out. They were presented in the form of advice to particular groups, so farm servants in this case, and they reveal a predominantly rural mindset, as seen here. I love the chap sitting on the bridge fishing. Communal church-going and listening to the word were, you won't be surprised to hear, very much to the fore. With growing levels of literacy and a shortage of simple reading materials, SPCK began its tract production in the 18th century, but formed a specific tract committee only in 1834, the year after the beginning of the Oxford Tracts for the Times. And in fact, this may have been an attempt to provide an episcopally sanctioned counterblast to the Tractarians. It certainly provided a rival to the influential Evangelical Religious Tract Society, which had been founded in 1799. The pre-publication approval process was convoluted, producing tracts which were designed to be inoffensive to the largest number of SPCK supporters. First, a new manuscript had to be recommended by 4 SPCK members and then referred to the Tract Committee via the Society's Standing Committee. It was read by members of the Tract Committee and then set in type, with proofs sent to 5 episcopal referees. Only once they had given approval and the author had agreed to any required changes was the revised document sent back to the Standing Committee, which authorised its onward progress to the Society's board. Then followed the most surprising part of the editorial process. A final decision on whether it should be published was settled by a ballot of the members. Yet despite these challenges, there were plenty of authors who were prepared to write tracts. For one reason, the work was well paid. And being published by SPCK was useful as a guarantee of one's orthodoxy. You could say, I'm an SPCK author. The peak years of tract production were in the period from 1850 to 1910, and in a representative year, 1859, 112 new titles were issued. Although many tracts were intended for general distribution, others were really quite specifically targeted. The Society's 1874 report indicates some of the categories that they were aiming to reach with specific tracts. Self-educated persons of average ability, semi-educated persons, imperfectly educated persons, infidels, deists, very plain people, untidy wives, and those with itching ears. And this was not a medical condition. It referred to those who wandered from church to chapel because their ears itched for something different. This targeted approach can be seen in the tracts relating to rites of passage, which frequently address themselves to specific social classes or genders. There are, unsurprisingly, tracts on marriage aimed at young men and others yet aimed at young women. There are those intended for middle-class couples and those for the working class, which are alarmingly explicit about the prevalence of domestic violence. There were no obvious concessions to scholarship. Westcott on the Resurrection was turned down by Bishop C.R. Sumner, Jackson and Ollivant in 1868, and Henry Alford was criticised for attempting his own translation of some verses in the Bible in 1864, this being seen as a slur on the authorised version. There were two main formats. There was the narrative form, most popular in the second half of the 19th century, which was designed to stimulate the interest of those in search of a short story. There was also the simple theological treatise, which was usually blended with practical instruction on how to conduct oneself at the rite of passage being discussed. They varied in length, but typically they were in the range of 10 to 20 pages and published excuse me, in a small format similar to the modern A6 international paper size. The shortest I found was a single sheet printed on one side with a list of do's and don'ts for a woman coming to a churching ceremony. Most of the tracts were anonymous, although the tract collection also contains some relevant longer works by named individuals. For example, Edward Berron's explanatory observation on the occasional offices of the Church of England. When a bishop or an archdeacon wrote, he usually did it under his own name. Thus, we have John Kay's advice to young ladies after their confirmation, which I'll talk a bit more about later, and George Davis's Village Conversations, which were really a series of narrative tracts on matters including baptism, catechism, confirmation, marriage, and churching, bound together in the collection as a single volume, but probably also issued individually. Far fewer tracts were produced in the early 20th century, and after the First World War, they turn into longer and more informative pamphlets written in short chapters or clear sections. Of course, none of the tract writers would have known the phrase rites of passage. They saw themselves as writing about the occasional offices of the Book of Common Prayer. It's to Arnold van Gennep that we owe the language and theory of rites of passage, and so I want to acknowledge him very briefly. Van Gennep published his famous book in 1909, but it wasn't translated into English until 1960. As is well known, part of his enduring significance comes from his having identified a threefold pattern of transition in people's lives: separation, transition, and incorporation. He saw these three states as together the schema of rites of passage: separation, transition, and incorporation. Certainly among modernists, it was the late John Bossy who was probably the first in our profession to adopt the terminology and Van Gennep's theory in his groundbreaking book, The English Catholic Community, published in 1975. Bossy realised its significance in delineating the boundaries of separation for a community which felt itself under threat. And he returns to rites of passage more generally in his book, Christianity in the West, published in 1985, which was one of the books that had an influence on me. So I'm now going to move to the first of my three things I'm going to talk about, which is marriage. I'll save the background to marriage legislation for the printed version of this paper, but suffice it to say that for the whole of the long 19th century, marriage was seen as the great public institution on which the stability of society rested. SPCK tract writers tried to instill a sense of the enormous spiritual risks and responsibilities that marriage entailed. Marriage was consistently treated as the least predictable and most hazardous of the rites of passage because it involved two souls in a complex relationship in which one could drag the other into perdition. It was presented, at least until the 20th century, as having profound implications for one's fortunes in the next life. And yet it lacked the compelling eschatological promises associated with baptism and confirmation. So selecting the most suitable partner was therefore paramount, and the tract writers delivered much advice about the qualities to look for. Working men should look for a good housekeeper who will shop well, cook well, and sew well. A neat, tidy, bright little woman to sit opposite you and chat to you. Working class girls should look for a young man who had been a good son. And if they couldn't find anyone suitable, they should stay single rather than risk a perilous marriage. Marrying someone from the same church was also considered highly desirable, presumably meaning someone of the same denomination, rather than restricting one's choice to worshippers at the parish church. Much of the advice was predictable and timeless. Barons urged people intending to marry to consider the disposition and habits of their partner when the first warmth of passion has subsided. The continuing theories of Thomas Malthus are seen late into the 19th century, with couples urged to delay marriage for as long as possible, using the lengthy engagement to save money and also to limit their fertility. A writer addressing a tract on reckless marriage to church workers expressed it somewhat callously. A bride of 17 may have had 6 children by the age of 25, but happily, they wrote, owing to the inexperience and neglect of these girl mothers, many of these unfortunate children early end their sufferings in death, but a sufficient number linger on, a misery to themselves and a burden to the state. 17-year-olds who wanted to marry should be told to wait for 8 years. The writer regretted that the clergy could not enforce this policy, but were legally obliged to marry couples if no one objected when the banns were called. Another tract against early marriage, this one addressed to the mothers of teenagers, suggested that marriage could be delayed by settling girls as residential servants and encouraging boys to lodge at YMCAs with restaurants, rather than looking for a young bride to cook and mend. There are echoes of the changing legal framework surrounding marriage. Civil marriage, granted from 1837, made it clear that matrimony was no longer seen as having exclusively religious overtones. Yet as late as 1880, SPCK issued a tract aiming to clarify the legal and ecclesiastical position on civil marriage. The writer said, "There seems no doubt that a marriage by a registrar is lawful, and however strongly we Christian churchmen must regret the adoption of such a mode of marriage, we are not justified in treating people who are married by a registrar as if they were not man or wife, or their children as if they were not legitimate. Nothing should be done which seemed to treat the law of the land with contempt. But if a civilly married couple decided that they would afterwards like to come to church, then they were entitled to have the full prayer book marriage service, with the omission of the publication of banns and the register signing." In contrast with the material on baptism, churching, and confirmation, which tends to be more ecclesiastically focused, the tracts on marriage tell us relatively little about the conduct that tract writers desired to see at the wedding ceremony itself. The overwhelming amount of material relates to choosing a partner and then surviving in the married state. When weddings are discussed, emphasis is placed on ensuring a serious demeanour among the bride and groom, and sometimes also the guests, I think is well illustrated in this particular picture, where they're all looking extremely serious. I think I neglected to mention that all of the illustrations in this talk are, of course, taken from SPCK tracts themselves. By no means all tracts had illustrations. In fact, they were fairly few, far and few between, but whenever I did find one with an illustration, I whipped out my phone and took a picture. So, serious demeanour is what's being encouraged. A reference to bad behaviour amongst those who come to see a wedding indicates that the convention of wedding services being attended only by invited guests had not yet been established. One of the tract writers says, "It is the people that go to the wedding that generally behave the worst. There are some idle gossips who are sure to be at every wedding, though they perhaps seldom are at church at any other time. And then there is often a noise and a going in and out and a clattering of pattens, so as to raise a great disturbance in the church and to make everything quite different from what it ought to be. Laughing when the banns are announced and gathering in ale houses before and after a wedding were also condemned. The emphasis was on having the bride and groom exhibit seriousness and religious reverence in the face of all the public interest and carousing." I shall move on now to churching. Whereas there has been fairly extensive discussion of the issues surrounding churching in early modern England, less evidence survives for the 19th century, although some of the old debates, for example, over the wearing of white veils, make a reappearance. SPCK claimed in 1876 that the duty of coming to church to give thanks after childbirth is one that, happily, is but seldom omitted. And perhaps the relatively small number of tracts issued on the subject suggests that it required little additional promotion. We know that it continued well into the 20th century. And as Sarah Williams has shown, particularly in working class communities, where it appears to have become a private ceremony, performed in church, spiritually significant, but hedged around with concerns about bad luck and ritual pollution. Writing in the early 1970s, the Anglican sociologist Bill Pickering noted the continued persistence of churching in the north of England. And Margaret Holbrook is going to be telling us more about churching in the 20th century tomorrow. I'm very much looking forward to what you've got to say, Margaret. We may note, of course, that a rite for churching did not make an appearance in the Alternative Service Book in 1980. Well, the 1662 liturgy, of course, was the one that they used, and following the revision of 1552, it provided the woman with an opportunity to give hearty thanks for having safely survived the great dangers of childbirth. And it did not hint at Levitical concerns about postpartum uncleanness. Indeed, the only Levitically derived requirement was in the rubric that she should offer accustomed offerings. Nevertheless, it is evident that ideas about new mothers being tainted and sources of ill luck had not disappeared. And a common feature of the SPCK Tracts was to hammer home the point that the service was a form of thanksgiving and not a cleansing from ritual pollution or, heaven forbid, a means of securing good luck. Edward Behrens declared that this part of the Jewish ritual, as well as the notion of legal pollution or defilement, was entirely done away with by our Blessed Saviour. But people wondered, why did the church provide a special thanksgiving for women who had survived childbirth, but not for those who wanted to give thanks for having overcome some other personal trauma? Behrens implied that friends and neighbours should use their time at the churching service to join in a general sense of thankfulness for their own deliverances. That's what you should be thinking about while the woman is being churched. Other writers felt that the only justification needed was that there was such a service in the prayer book. To promote this idea, the Bishop of Peterborough penned a dialogue between a Mrs. Brown, who had just had a baby, and her friend Mrs. Walker, with the women making alternating speeches on the duty of postpartum thankfulness and the beauty of the liturgy, which would be the vehicle for their thanksgiving. A much repeated theme was the importance of the churching service happening in the context of public Sunday worship. A tract of 1856 stated that a woman should attend the churching ceremony as soon as her feet can carry her beyond her own threshold, advice which perhaps only served to reinforce the popular belief that an unchurched woman was a source of contamination. The writer added that the woman had a further cause for gratitude if the child had survived, which underlines the point that the ceremony was intended to be a thanksgiving for the survival of the mother and all about the woman, irrespective of what had happened to the baby. The clergy's strong preference for public churching clashed with various social conventions. In 1808, the Anglican poet-priest George Crabbe had pointed out the incongruity of the amorous dame who, For rite of churching soon she made her way, in dread of scandal, should she miss the day. 2 matrons came, with them she humbly knelt, their actions copied and their comforts felt. Presumably the possibility of one's wife having to kneel down in public beside the local amorous dame was one of the reasons why men as well as women could be critical of the clerical expectation for public churching. The ceremony might create a worrisome level of equality among new mothers of different social stations. Another poet-priest, John Keble, drew on the medieval tradition advocating the veiling of women, which had been revived in the early 17th century as a marker of high church ceremonial. He saw this as having the double benefit of being both a return to an ancient custom and also making the woman less identifiable and largely inaudible. This is a little couplet from his poem, The Churching of Women, published in the Christian Year. Slight tremblings only of her veil declare, soft answers duly whispered to each soothing prayer. So not only could she hardly be identified, she could hardly be heard. Percy Dearmer, at the end of the 19th century, alluded to the ancient veiling custom in the earliest editions of the Parson's Handbook, but almost, in the earliest editions at least, almost as a historical curiosity. But by the time he produced the enlarged edition in 1902, he was advocating it. He advised that the verger should keep a clean veil and hand it to all the women coming to be churched, which was an admission, of course, that they would not be arriving at the ceremony ready veiled. In characteristic Dearmer style, he was precise about the details. The veil should be about 4 feet square, of very thin linen, so that it could be placed over the bonnet. But we don't know how many early 20th century women came forward, swathed in linen, to kneel at the feet of the clergyman, with the verger or parish clerk also in attendance, as Dearmer directed. Although maybe Margaret will enlighten us tomorrow. In the 1928 prayer book, the rubrical reference to decent apparel was dropped. As we've seen, this has become focused on the wearing of the veil. The idea that she should come wearing decent apparel. It was replaced, interestingly, with the instruction that the husband should attend, if he so desire. This hinted, I think, rather strongly that the ceremony was now understood to be a private one. For surely, if it had been in the context of public worship, there would have been an unspoken expectation of the husband's attendance. Another intriguing alteration in 1928 was the substitution of the word priest for minister. Whilst this meant that the rite could now be performed by deacons, around this time there was also discussion of extending the duties of deaconesses to include churching. And this was recommended in the Lambeth Conference in 1930, although not, apparently, widely adopted. But perhaps it signalled, whether consciously or not, a return to the situation which had pertained in early modern England, in which churching had been a ceremony that the new mother had shared with her midwife and with other female friends, and which had also contained an important element of all-female socialising. There was a small flurry of churching tracts in the 1870s. There were, it seemed, so many questions about churching that had to be answered, explained, and defended. Why, for example, did it not take place in the Church of Scotland? Did it bring good luck? And did the absence of it bring bad luck? Could one leave the house and go to town if unchurched? What happened to the money that the woman offered? Why was the fee not fixed? These and other matters were discussed in what appears to have been SPCK's final tract on the subject in 1890, which helpfully illustrated a broad range of popular understandings and then provided answers. And it's from that tract, the only one which had an illustration, that the picture that you're looking at comes. Perhaps it was evident by the 1890s to the SPCK Tract Committee that churching was being recast into the realm of folk religion, and perhaps this also provides the context for Percy Dearmer's attempt to resuscitate it at the end of the decade and at the very beginning of the 20th century. And now I'm going to move on to confirmation. As is quite well known, the Church of England's rite of confirmation retained its popularity with both sexes, but particularly girls, into the 1960s. It was the traditional point of entry into full adult participation in the church, as the candidates confirmed for themselves the promises which had been made at their baptism. But as a rite of passage, historically, its cultural significance was probably more important than its rather muddled theological meaning. If baptism resulted in incorporation into the body of Christ, what was the point of assembling the baptized in large groups in their early teens in the presence of a bishop and delivering what appeared to be a spiritual booster jab? At some point early in the 20th century, confirmation ceased to be inextricably linked to catechizing. But before that, children were expected to commit to memory the whole catechism, which began with the simple, "What is your name?" and rapidly moved into much more complex territory. The idea was that clergy and teachers would drill children in the catechism until they had it off by heart, and thus the intergenerational transfer of religious knowledge would be assured. SPCK published around 180 tracts on confirmation, which was about 100 more than were produced for either marriage or baptism, and vastly more than were produced for churching. Presumably, it regarded confirmation candidates as a captive market, sufficiently literate, and as they prepared for the service, open to religious influence. Probably the most frequently repeated theme was that the grace conferred at confirmation, when properly received, gave the recipient the power to resist the impulses of youth as they entered upon the period when they would be, as one writer put it, beset with temptation and no longer under the watchful protection of your parents. In a narrative tract from 1891, a boy tells another boy that the purpose of confirmation was to give the strength to resist temptation. And the fact that so many returned from the ceremony apparently unchanged was a sign that they had thrown the gift away. Bishop Kay, in this tract that we're looking at, his one aimed at young ladies, let's have a look at the illustration the right way around now, made much of the dangers to which they would be exposed as they entered the world of gaiety and amusement. And in the years before, they entered upon their duties as wives and mothers. So as well as being a vaccination against temptation, confirmation was also regarded as a gateway. Entry was limited to those who passed the test. And the test, as I've mentioned, was the Catechism. As Edward Behrens wrote, the great prerequisite for confirmation is a competent knowledge of the Church Catechism. For those who were able to achieve a pass and get their ticket from their parish clergyman to take to the confirmation to confirm that they had learnt enough and been tested, for those who achieved this pass, the way was open to admission to Holy Communion. Although, as a writer in 1888 noted, many who are confirmed never come to Holy Communion. Another writer implied that confirmation could function as a break clause for those who no longer wished to be associated with Christianity. If we neglect confirmation, we show that we no longer wish to be considered members of the Christian body. Well, this was a softening of the harsher message conveyed by a tract writer of the late 18th century, who had declared that now that the religious welfare was no longer the responsibility of their parents and godparents, eternity is before you, and it is left to your own choice whether you be happy or miserable forever. It will therefore be your own fault if you bring God's curse upon you and not a blessing. The tract writer's comments about candidates' behaviour during and after the confirmation service shows their ongoing concerns about large numbers of young people brought together for what many of them regarded as essentially a day of festivity. Bishop George Davis used a dialogue tract between his village characters, George and Thomas, to reflect on confirmation practices in 1850 and in the previous generation. It was published in 1850, but they were thinking about their earlier experience. Thomas's son is due to be confirmed. And in his conversation, Thomas reflects on his own confirmation, presumably back in the 1830s. He says that they had been taken to the service in the church warden's wagon. And he remembers that they laughed the whole of the way. When the service was over, they went to the alehouse for bread and cheese and beer, and we all thought it was nothing else but a fine holiday. The sensible William speaks up for the church warden, who had arranged the wagon so that they did not arrive hot and weary, and had taken them to the alehouse because they needed some refreshment. If Thomas had behaved badly or had improper thoughts, it was nobody's fault but his own. After reflecting on all this, Thomas decides that he will give up a day's work in order to take his son to the confirmation so that he might stand a better chance of keeping out of harm's way. This seems to be an admission that even in the fictionalised rural parish imagined by Bishop Davis, rowdy confirmation could still be assumed to be a problem. And it was partly for these reasons that in the second half of the century, they became smaller and perhaps more carefully segregated by gender and or class. So obviously here we see the young ladies being segregated by gender, and it looks as if there are some young men in the background who are going to come through next. And in this picture from the late 1880s, we can see more young ladies and the bishop standing on a remarkably looking pavement. Slightly strange. So, to conclude, what does this evidence tell us about the church and rites of passage? Well, first, it allows us to hear the Church of England's officially sanctioned collective voice. And actually, we don't hear that very often in the 19th century. The extremely cumbersome editorial processes and the very heavy episcopal involvement gives to the tract collection a status which I think extends beyond its significance as a survival of once widely distributed but essentially ephemeral popular religious literature. The editorial constraints ensured that the teaching in the SPCK tracts remained very consistent over the decades. And as can be typical of religious literature, they often continue to imagine a world that was rather rapidly passing away. The seemingly unreflective tangle of theological ideas with contemporary social and economic theories is itself very revealing. Secondly, the tract collection provides further evidence of the Church's central obsession with the Book of Common Prayer. Well, we know that the prayer book was a defining feature of 19th century Anglicanism. There's nothing new to claim here, but the tracts show again just how important it was. Arguments are often ended with a simple appeal to its authority. And in the narrative tracts, the story form tracts, a much repeated trope is the production of a prayer book, a well-thumbed prayer book, obviously, from the pocket of the more knowledgeable character who goes through the relevant service with the character who needs to be instructed. And in this way, Anglican doctrine is portrayed as being passed on among the literate working classes. Beautiful is perhaps the word used most frequently to describe the prayer book, and it's mentioned much more frequently than the Bible. Thirdly, the tracts give an insight into, frankly, the generally dismal fare served up for the instruction of the tens of thousands of people who lived in the Anglican tradition. In short, confirmation, rather than being the opportunity to articulate faith for oneself, was seen as the vaccine against temptation. And if the vaccine appeared not to take, then to hell one might go. An unwise marriage would likely lead to the same fate. For new mothers, there were multiple pressures to get to the church in pew and a fair amount of mixed messaging. Of course, it seems likely that the advice in the tracts was often disregarded. The human spirit prevailed. For people of all sorts and conditions, confirmations, weddings, and safe recoveries from childbirth remained occasions for personal and communal celebration and festivity. But at a time when many of the church's leading thinkers were moving towards a more incarnational theology, it seems to have struggled, SPCK seemed to have struggled with expressing a more life-affirming tone in their popular prints, at least until after the First World War, when the tone did change markedly. And I'll be able to say more about that in the printed version of this. That's when it really does become the long 19th century that goes up to about 1958. Finally, the tracts give us some insight into these multi-purpose rituals. It was not just that clergy and participants were often seeking different meanings within the ceremonies themselves, they were layering legal, theological, social, and cultural levels of meaning on top of each other. Liminality and communitas, separation and incorporation, privacy and publicity, and contemporary expectations concerning class status and segregation versus the liturgical assumption that all Christians should be treated in a similar way. All these factors created contradictions and tensions, but these ceremonies would not have been functioning as rites of passage if that had not been so. Thank you very much.